Hello everyone and welcome back to Two-Dimensional Design. This lecture is going to be in two parts. The first part will go over the principles of two-dimensional design, and then part two will be the elements. So you'll be watching this in two separate instances. So today we're going to begin looking at the foundations of visual art and design, the principles and elements of design. Again, we'll begin with the principles and then we'll come back later to discuss the elements. Now, these concepts function as the visual language artists and designers use to communicate ideas, emotions, movement, atmosphere, and meaning. Now, whether we are looking at painting, photography, graphic design, fashion, architecture, film, advertising, or even social media, these visual tools shape the way we experience and interpret images. The elements are the individual building blocks of visual art, things like shape, color, texture, value, and space. And the principles are the ways artists organize and arrange those elements to create sensations like emphasis, rhythm, balance, unity, movement, and to create visual impact. Even if we are not consciously aware of them, we respond to these concepts constantly in everyday life. Certain colors attract our attention, certain compositions feel balanced or chaotic, repetition creates rhythm, and contrast creates emphasis, for example. Designers, artists, and visual communicators use these relationships intentionally to guide the viewer's eye and to shape their viewing experience. Understanding the principles and elements of design gives us a framework for both analyzing images more critically and creating work more intentionally. So as we move through this lecture, I want you to begin thinking not just about what an image depicts, but how it is constructed visually and why those choices matter. So what are the design principles and elements? Visual design principles and elements are guidelines that help create visually appealing and effective designs. Artists and designers use the elements and principles the same way writers use words and sentence structure to communicate ideas, emotions, atmosphere, movement, and meaning visually. The elements and principles of design, again, are the foundation of visual art and design. The elements are the basic visual components artists and designers use to create images, while the principles are the way those components are organized and arranged to create meaning, movement, balance, emphasis, and overall visual impact. Now, the principles, again, are the ways we organize and arrange visual information. Those principles are unity, emphasis and focal point, scale and proportion, balance, and rhythm. Now, sometimes they go by different names, but for our course, this is what we'll refer to them as. Unity is the sense that all parts of the design work together to create harmony. Emphasis and focal point are the area of a design that draws the viewer's attention. Scale and proportion is the relationship in size between different parts of a design. Balance is the visual weight in a design and how that's distributed to create stability or instability. And rhythm is the use of repetition or variation to create movement and flow. Now, I want you to look at this image on the right by Paula Rego, the artist in her studio. I want you to look back at the left at those 5 design principles: unity, emphasis or focal point, scale and proportion, balance and rhythm, and think about how the artist has used those principles in this design to create visual impact. Now, when I look at this design, I'm drawn directly to the center. Right? I feel that that center image is emphasized. How has the artist emphasized this image? I think it's the placement. It's directly in the center that draws your eye. There's a really strong and vibrant use of color that doesn't exist throughout the composition, those reds and purples. So it really draws in, whereas the other color combinations are more cool. We see more blues and greens throughout the rest of the composition. There's also interesting uses of scale and proportion and a really interesting use of rhythm, and I wonder if you can see that. Just take a moment to look at this and see what stands out for you in terms of those 5 types of principles. Now again, the elements are the components of a design. They are what the design is made of. For elements, we'll discuss line, shape, pattern and texture, illusion of space, illusion of motion, value, and color. Now a line is a mark with length and direction that can define shape and imply movement. Shape is a 2-dimensional area created by a line or a color, value, or texture. Pattern and texture are repetition and surface quality used to create a sense of visual rhythm and interest. Illusion of space is the use of perspective, the use of overlap, size, and placement, and all of these components help create depth in a composition. The illusion of motion are visual cues that suggest movement in a composition or create a sense of visual rhythm or action. Value is the range of lightness and darkness used to create form and contrast. And then finally, color. Color is the hue, value, and intensity that creates mood, harmony, and emphasis. So if we look at this image on the right by Joanna Chomali, I wonder how you can see these elements are being employed. There's a really interesting use of pattern and texture I see in both the figure and the water and the air. I also see there's a really interesting sense of motion created by the texture of the water. I'm also seeing line created by what's connecting the figure to the boat. If you think back to principles, I wonder if you can look at some of the components there and apply those to this composition as well. Okay, so this is part 1. We're going to start here and discuss those 5 design principles, and then we'll pause at the end of principles and we'll come back and discuss the elements. So before we begin discussing the elements of design, we first need to understand the principles. The principles, again, are the ways artists, makers, and designers organize visual information within a composition. The principles help determine how an image feels, how the viewer's eye moves throughout the work, where attention is directed, and whether a composition feels unified, balanced, chaotic, energetic, or calm. While the elements, again, are the building blocks of visual art, the principles are the strategies used to arrange those parts together. Artists use principles like balance, rhythm, unity, emphasis, and scale to create structure, to visualize relationships within a composition, and to create meaning within an image. As we move through this section, think about how these principles shape not only works of art, but also advertising, social media, film, photography, fashion, architecture, and other forms of visual culture we encounter every day. Okay, we're going to start with unity. So another term for design is composition. Visual composition is the intentional placement of visual objects on a surface to create a sense of organization. Even when the surface is chaotic, we can see elements of control and intention from the artist. Unity in design is planned by the artist. It can occur naturally, however, but it is often executed through skills in creating a unified pattern or a sense of visual cohesion from organization of varied elements. Unity occurs when all of the elements of a piece combine to make a balanced, harmonious, complete whole. Unity is the feeling of harmony between all parts of the artwork, creating a sense of completeness. a totality that combines all of its parts into one complete, cohesive whole. Unity is the thing that joins the parts together. Now, there are a few different types of unity that we're going to explore in this course. Unity by proximity, unity by repetition, and unity by continuation or flow. Unity by proximity, those are the images on the top and bottom of that left side of that quadrant. Now, unity by proximity are when elements are placed close together, making separate elements, in this instance separate shapes, look like they belong together. On the left top image, you see a very unified proximity. These elements are close together, they're in close proximal relationship, and that really creates a sense of cohesion. The bottom left image is somewhat unified. There's a little bit of a break of that consistency, but we still see a harmonious composition by how proximal or how close those shapes are together. Unity by repetition is when an element repeats in a design that helps to create a relationship between the various elements in the design. The element that repeats may be almost anything: a color, a shape, a texture, a direction, or even an angle. That center top and bottom square is unity by repetition. The top, again, is very unified. The bottom is somewhat. So you can see how there's variation, but they're still creating that sensation of a unified image by this repetition of shape and form. And then finally, we have unity by continuation or flow. Now, this is when there is an element in the design that continues. Usually it's a line, an edge, or a direction from one form to another. The viewer's eye is carried smoothly in this instance from one element to the next. Now, the top is very, and the bottom, even though I'm obscuring it a little bit, is somewhat. We can see how there's this almost snake-like rhythm created by this continuous direction of shape that's been created. And this creates this harmonious, rhythmic kind of composition because of the placement of those shapes together in this flowing type form. Although they're broken up a little bit in the bottom, it still gives this sense of continuation and flow. Our eyes are being drawn to follow that shape around. So next we have emphasis and focal point. So emphasis and focal point in design is the intentional placement or treatment of an element or set of elements within a composition to draw the attention of the viewer and encourage the viewer to look closer and deeper into the composition. The artist creates an area of interest or focal point. The elements can vary in size, color, shape, texture, placement, etc. And these areas of focal interest allow the viewer's eye to move through the composition. So if we look at this painting by Andrew Wyeth, I wonder what you see as the area of focal interest that has been emphasized as our focal point, and how that's allowing our eyes to move throughout the composition. To me, the woman in the pink dress stands out as the area of emphasis or focal point, partly because of its placement, partly because of the color shift in the pink dress. And then that placement draws my eyes to the farmhouse at the top right corner of the composition, and then that draws me around to the left side of the composition. That shadow in the grass brings me right back down to the foot on the figure, and it starts that visual direction all over again. So there are several different ways to achieve emphasis. We have emphasis by contrast, isolation, and placement here. Now, emphasis by contrast is a focal point resulting from one element that differs from the others. Whatever interrupts an overall feeling or pattern automatically attracts the eye by this difference. The difference can be in color, tone, value, shape, form, or style. In emphasis by isolation, a focal point results from one element or a group of elements that are isolated or separated from the rest. Often this is achieved by placement and distance between elements in the work, but it can also be used in more emotive ways of depicting an emotional kind of isolation. And then we have emphasis by placement, a focal point resulting from the intentional location of an element or groups of elements in a composition. We think back to the painting we just looked at. And an artist may choose to draw attention to the center of the page, or purposefully place objects in areas of the composition that will create a visual flow, guiding the viewer to a specific area. If we look at this painting on the left, Moon Mask, how do we feel the artist is using emphasis here? Is it emphasis by contrast, emphasis by isolation, or emphasis by placement, or a combination of some or all? What do you think? And then there is also an intentional tool of no emphasis or focal point. So an artist may choose to intentionally stray from calling attention to any one element or grouping of elements in a composition. A definitive focal point in this case is not necessary to create a successful design. An artist may wish to emphasize the entire surface of a composition over any individual element. We often see a lack of focal point in something called an all-over pattern design, in abstract works, in collages, and in some cases, even landscapes. Without a focal point, the viewer's attention is directed slowly to all of the parts of the composition. So we can see here in this piece, Shattered Light by Lee Krasner, excuse that typo, there is no one focal point. Our attention is drawn throughout this composition. So we're invited to investigate it as a whole by looking at the different parts and areas of this composition. Next, we have scale and proportion. So scale and proportion are related terms. They both basically refer to size. Scale is a means of measuring. For example, an architect may create a scale drawing or plan where 1/4 inch equals a foot. In order to understand an object or artwork scale, we must have a point of reference. The point of reference offers an understanding of proportion. Proportion refers to relative size, size measured against against other elements or against some mental norm or standard. Scale and proportion in art are both concerned with size. Scale refers to the size of an object, the whole, in relationship to another object, another whole. In art, the size relationship between an object and the human body is significant. Proportion within an art piece is how various objects relate to each other. So if we look at this installation by Yayoi Kusama on the right, if those people weren't there to create that human scale reference, if we just saw this image, we would have no idea the size of this installation. We could look at it, it could be a 1 inch by 1 inch installation, it could be 100 foot by 100 foot, we would have no idea. So the human scale reference here lets us know what the proportions of each of these objects are to the other. So some of those factors we just learned about that human scale reference. In scale and proportion is human scale reference, power of unusual size, internal proportions, and contrast of scale. So again, that human scale reference is one way to think of artistic scale, is to consider the scale of the work itself, its size in relation to other art, in relation to its surroundings, or in relationship to human size. Excuse me. We also see this translate to the power of unusual scale. Excuse me. The power of unusual scale. Unusual or unexpected scale is arresting and attention-getting. We can look here to the left on this painting of unusual scale by Jenny Saville. Now, exaggerated or monumental artworks can force the viewer to see the form with fresh eyes or discover new associations with meaning and intent. Now, it's interesting to think of these paintings by Jenny Saville and wonder, why did she choose to make them such a dramatic scale? What is the meaning behind this work rather than making this an 18 by 24 painting? There's also internal proportions. This is another way to discuss artistic scale, and it's to consider the size and scale of elements within the design or pattern itself. Here, the scale is relative to the overall area of the format. For instance, a big element in one painting might be small in a larger work. The proportion describes the size relationships between various parts of a unit. And then we have contrast of scale. This is the purposeful, intentional use of scale to attract attention in different ways. This can occur in a composition when small objects are magnified and exaggerated, oversized, right? The typical scale that they would appear is oversized or reduced, right? So we might see a water bottle exaggerated to be the size of a house, and a house exaggerated to be the size, or reduced to be the size of an ant. Some other things we see in scale and proportion is hieractic scale. We don't see that quite as much anymore. Fantastical or a surreal scale, and then proportion set to the human standard. So the hieractic scale is the increasing the size of a figure on a composition to emphasize its importance. Now, this is when all figures are on the same plane, but the use of scale is signifying which figure has more importance or perceived value. This is something we see a lot in Renaissance or in religious or spiritual subject matter. We don't really see it that much that used frequently. There's also fantastical or surreal scale. These are scale changes that can be used intentionally to intrigue or mystify the viewer rather than to clarify a focal point. A scale change can be an element of fantasy, like the small door that Alice can't fit through until she shrinks in Alice in Wonderland. And then we have the human standard of proportion. So this was first set by the Roman architect Vitruvius. It's the proportions of the ideal figure, right? It's the body is typically 8 heads tall, the outstretched arms equal the height of the figure. We can all look back to the Vitruvius human standard proportion. These proportions also apply generally to other parts of the body. For instance, if we're looking at the facial structure, there are certain mathematical human standard proportions on where the eyes sit on the skull, the nose, the mouth, where the edges of the mouth fall, at the edge of the pupil, where the width of the face is 5 eyes wide, etc. And then there's also other geometry that shows up in proportion. So proportion is linked to ratio. We won't go into this too in depth, but the ancient Greeks desired to discover ideal proportions. And these took the form of mathematical ratios. Lots of folks can argue about ideal proportions and that significance, but they sought perfect proportions in rectangles and employed those in architectural design. Among these rectangles, the one most cited as perfect is the golden rectangle. The proportions of the golden rectangle can be expressed in the ratio of parts to the whole. So if we look at that image on the top left, we can see it broken up into parts. Now this ratio, it's called the ratio of the golden mean, is width is to length as length is to length plus width. Gets a little complicated there. But the proportion, what's interesting is this is found in growth patterns in nature. We see it in a chambered nautilus shell, we see it in plants, and even within human anatomy. Another way of looking at this ratio is calling it by the rule of thirds. So as we see on the image on the bottom that's mirrored this golden mean, we could see that the area of focus or emphasis is not placed in the center of the composition. It's moved into the third, right side of the composition. This creates almost a natural visual interest because this is a shape that we see in nature. So this rule of thirds is sometimes employed by artists to create a visually engaging, visually effective, almost naturally appealing composition because it mimics that pattern in nature. Next, we have balance. So balance is the equal distribution of visual weight. It is a universal aim in composition. The vast majority of compositions we see have been either consciously or unconsciously balanced by the artist or designer. A sense of balance to us is innate. As children, we develop a sense of balance in our bodies and observe balance in the world around us. Lack of balance or imbalance can be quite disturbing. And sometimes that is intentional by the artist. So we'll discuss pictorial balance. And in assessing pictorial balance, we always assume a center vertical axis and usually expect to see some kind of equal visual weight distributed on either side of that axis. So in my bubble right here, this is not an equal distribution of weight. However, if I move to the center, it would be more. Now the axis functions as the fulcrum on a scale or a seesaw, and the two sides should achieve a sense of equilibrium. In speaking of pictorial balance, we are almost always referencing horizontal balance, the right and left sides of an image. But artists consider vertical balance as well. And imagine horizontal axis then divides a work top and bottom. So if we look at this image to our left by Frida Kahlo, the two Fridas, we can see that there is a center axis breaking that image in half and a general balance of weight on either side. And then there is intentional imbalance that artists can employ. And this imbalance occurs when the components of a piece do not occur in equal amounts. A composition that is imbalanced with greater emphasis on one side may do so for the dramatic effect of either movement or of an unfolding narrative. An artist may, because of a particular theme or topic, expressly desire that a picture becomes uneasy to view, that it creates an uncomfortable response in the viewer. In this instance, imbalance can be a useful tool. The components of a piece do not occur in equal amounts when we're considering how imbalance is employed. So if we look at this painting here, The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali, that red line in the center divides this composition in half for our viewing purpose. It's not original in the painting, but we can see that there's an imbalance here. There's not an equal distribution of weight on either sides of that axis. And Salvador Dali is a surrealist, right? So he is painting an alternate kind of reality, right? He's creating this really interesting composition, this commentary on time. So it's interesting that he's specifically chosen to use an imbalance of components to lean into this kind of surreal, uneasy feeling. So the types of balance that we're going to explore this semester are symmetrical balance, asymmetrical balance, radial balance, and crystallographic balance, or that all-over patterning that I mentioned. Now, symmetrical balance is when shapes are repeated in the same positions on either side of the vertical axis. One side becomes the mirror image of the other. So if we look at this quadrant, that top left is symmetrical. Asymmetrical balance is a balance that is achieved with dissimilar objects that have equal visual weight or equal eye attraction. Visual balance is maintained when two sides of the composition each provide a visual emphasis. That example right next to it is asymmetrical. There's a kind of comprehensive amount of visual balance maintained, but there isn't that mirror image, right? That vertical axis or horizontal axis, there isn't the same visual weight distributed on either side. Then we have radial balance. Now this one is interesting. It's found in nature. And this is when all elements in the design radiate out from the center, and it forms a common central point. Radial balance is not entirely distinct from symmetrical or asymmetrical balance. It's just a refinement of one or the other. Depending on whether the focus occurs middle or off center, you'll see this in nature forms once you start looking for it. And then we have crystallographic balance or all over patterning. And this is when compositions exhibit an equal emphasis over the whole format, right? There's no one specific focal point. And the same weight or eye attraction is literally spread everywhere throughout the composition. A constant repetition of the same quality is everywhere on the surface. That's your bottom right. We see this in wallpaper. We see this used in a lot of different advertisements, right? It's creating this surface texture of just kind of consistent visual weight throughout the composition. And next we have rhythm. So rhythm in design refers to interval repeating elements. An agreed element's location creates a sound structure. Rhythm can unite, direct, highlight, and set the dynamics of a composition. There is a repetition of shape, color, tone, texture, accents, direction, and dynamism. The connection between visual rhythms and musical rhythms can be more than just a simile or metaphor. And in some cases, the visual rhythms composed by an artist seem to resonate with memories or associations in our other senses. There's a lot of really interesting media out there about synesthesia or how people process sound, rhythm, color. When a visual experience actually stimulates one of our other senses, that effect is called kinesthetic empathy, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, visual movement is the principle of art used to create the impression of action in a work of art, an impression of action. Visual rhythm is created by repeating shapes, a pattern, lines, colors, or any other visual component, so repetition is part of this. The artist can also imply movement by placing the subject in space in a way that only makes sense if it's moving. If we look at this painting to the right by Cynthia St. James, how do you think the artist has used different components to create a sense of visual rhythm? Now, rhythm is a term we most often associate with the sense of hearing. Without words, music can intrigue us by its pulsating beat, inducing us to tap a foot or even dance. Poetry often has a meter, which is a term for measurable rhythm. The pace of words can establish a cadence, a repetitive flow of syllables that makes reading poems aloud a pleasure. But rhythm can also be a visual sensation. We commonly speak of rhythm when watching the movement displayed by athletes, dancers, or some workers performing manual tasks. In a similar way, the quality of rhythm can be applied to the visual arts, in which it is again basically related to movement. Here, the concept refers to the movement of the viewer's eye, a movement across recurrent motifs, providing the repetition inherent in the idea of rhythm. Rhythm, as a design principle, is based on repetition. Repetition, as an element of visual unity, is exhibited in some manner by almost every work of art. However, Rhythm involves a clear repetition of elements that are the same or only slightly modified. Now, if we look at this image on the left, what elements do you see that are the same or slightly modified that are causing that sense of visual rhythm? Just a warning that the next image is a flickering image and may cause visual disturbance in those who are sensitive to strobe or flickering light. So next we have this visual sensation called chromostereopsis. It is a visual illusion where the impression of depth is conveyed in two-dimensional color images, usually red-blue or red-green colors. These types of color combinations appear to vibrate when placed next to each other. These dominant colors, when placed next to each other, cause the eye to rapidly go back and forth and flicker. That creates a visual rhythm and a sense of visual vibration. This can be very intense, as I mentioned, for folks who have any kind of visual disturbance issues. Now, there are other types of rhythm. There's motion and shapes. There's alternating patterns, vibrating colors, and progressive rhythm. Now, motion and shapes are when rhythm can be achieved through the use of shapes. Rhythm can, and their arrangement. There's a couple different types of shapes here. Legato is a sense of flow and gentle curvilinear movement, where repeated curves and fluid strokes carry the eye across the page, like the image on the left. If you think of a flowing river, this might be legato. Staccato are abrupt changes with dynamic contrast. These are rectilinear shapes and lines. They tend to be vibrant and quick. We're going to talk a little bit about suprematism. That is this kind of staccato sensation. You could also think of a kind of jagged stairwell that goes up as staccato. We also see alternating patterns that can cause rhythm. Now, this is successive patterns in which the same elements reappear in regular order. Motifs alternate consistently with one another to produce a regular and anticipated sequence. Vibrating colors, these, like we just witnessed, are colors that create a flickering effect along their border. And the effect usually depends on an equal value relationship and a strong contrast. And then we have progressive rhythm. So this is rhythm involving repetition, but repetition of a shape that changes in a regular manner. There is a feeling of a sequential pattern. This type of rhythm is most often achieved with a progressive variation of size and shape. Elements going from larger to smaller, smaller to larger, color progression, etc. So it could be shape, color, value, or texture, but it's in this progressive varying element. Now, the other types of rhythm is polyrhythmic or suprematism. So polyrhythmic structures are complex patterns that employ more than one rhythm or beat. An overlay of several rhythmic patterns produces a complex result, even if the parts are simple. And then suprematism, we don't really see this much anymore, but it's an art movement focused on basic geometric forms such as circles, squares, lines, and rectangles, painted in a limited range of colors. The term suprematism refers to abstract art based upon the supremacy of pure artistic feeling, rather than on a visual depiction of objects. This type of art form is intended to create a sensation in the viewer, to create a feeling, the taste of metal, or the sound of metal clanking, for example. The supremacist painters wanted to transfer a sense of feeling. They wanted viewers to feel that sensation of hard metal clanking on itself. Okay, so that's part one. We're going to pause here and we're going to come back to discuss the elements. And when we do, I want you to start to see the relationships and the overlaps that we will have with those 5 principles of design and how those start to overlap and relate to the elements. Everything that we're discussing is interrelated and integral, and it all builds upon itself. So we're going to pause here, and I'll see you back.